They laughed when she mentioned a will. They scoffed, rolled their eyes, because in their minds she was already invisible. Just a grandmother. Just an old woman with crocheted slippers and fading memories. But the truth, they had no idea who they were dealing with. And when the lawyer finally opened the envelope, silence fell like a thunderclap. This is the story of how one grandmother turned quiet betrayal into a masterclass in legacy and revenge. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay until the end, because this story changes everything. Margaret Elise Hartman wasn't a woman who asked for much. She never had been. At 76, she still kept her garden tidy, made her bed each morning, and remembered everyone's birthdays, even if her phone stayed silent on her own. To the outside world, Margaret had done everything right. She'd raised 2 children, stood by her husband for 45 years, and never complained when life got hard. But within her family, she was slowly disappearing, fading into the wallpaper of a home once filled with laughter and shared meals. Now she was just there, an afterthought. Her son, Andrew, visited only when he needed something, usually to ask for help covering payroll for his construction firm or to pick up a check for emergencies. He never stayed long. He never asked how she was holding up on her own. He didn't notice that the fridge was nearly empty or that the same coat hung by the door every visit because Margaret had stopped going out unless she had to. Her daughter, Kathy, was kinder but tired. She was raising teenagers, working long hours, and carrying the emotional weight of everyone else. She'd call on holidays, send flowers now and then. But her voice was often rushed, and her presence, though more sincere, was still fleeting. The grandchildren barely registered Margaret's existence unless it was Christmas. Then came the polite thank you texts after gift cards arrived, usually followed by silence. Margaret kept a box of their old drawings in her closet, the ones they made when they were little, when they still thought of her as magical. Then came the brunch. It was just an ordinary Sunday. Margaret had spent the morning baking scones from scratch, the same recipe her mother once taught her. She laid out the good china, the one she only brought out on special occasions. She even wore her lavender cardigan, the one her husband always said brought out her eyes. They sat around the table chatting about real estate, TikTok trends, and someone's gluten intolerance, when Kathy laughed lightly and said, "Mom, you should write a will. I mean, just in case. We don't want to fight over your $1 million china set." Andrew laughed. One of the grandkids smirked. The joke wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was the kind of comment that stung because of what it meant underneath. They didn't think of her as a person with real thoughts, memories, or, God forbid, a legacy worth protecting. Just an old woman with a few trinkets. Margaret smiled. Small, careful smile. She didn't say much. Just nodded and poured herself some more tea. But something had shifted. They laughed at the idea of her having anything of value. Not just things but power, purpose, choice. And that moment, surrounded by family and forgotten at the same time, was when she decided, if they were going to forget her in life, they would damn well remember her in death. Margaret didn't storm out that day. She didn't raise her voice, flip the table, or cry in the bathroom like some might. That wasn't her style. Margaret's strength had never come from loud declarations. It came from silence, observation, and patience. She had lived a lifetime reading between the lines, knowing when to speak and when to wait. Now she was waiting, but with purpose. That night, after everyone left, she sat by the window with her lukewarm tea and stared out into the garden. The roses were blooming early that year. Her late husband, Walter, used to say the roses bloomed best when something was about to change. She reached for the little wooden box in the drawer by the phone. Inside were papers. The deed to the house, old savings bonds Walter had tucked away, and a few letters she'd never sent. Margaret wasn't poor, far from it. Walter had been smart with money. Between his pension, the house, which had appreciated wildly over the decades, and the quiet little investment portfolio she'd kept private, Margaret had built a small empire in silence. No one had ever asked about it. They assumed she lived modestly because she had no other choice. They never thought to question the calm quiet in which she moved. That assumption, that underestimation, was their first mistake. The next morning, Margaret called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. She wanted someone sharp, unflinching, and discreet. She found Eleanor Marks, a woman in her 40s with a reputation for airtight wills and no tolerance for drama. They met at a small office above a bakery on Main Street. Eleanor listened, took notes, and occasionally raised an eyebrow, but never interrupted. When Margaret finished explaining what she wanted, there was a pause. Then Eleanor smiled, not cruelly but knowingly. "You're very clear about what you want," she said. "Most clients aren't. They get sentimental. They want to leave the door open." Margaret nodded slowly. "That's how they walk all over you. I've left the door open for 76 years. They met 3 more times over the next 2 months. Margaret brought documents, dates, and passwords. She left nothing to chance. The final version of the will was a masterpiece, crafted like a story with specific allocations, a few unexpected twists, and most importantly, conditions. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't out to ruin anyone. But she made sure that loyalty would be rewarded. And neglect, that would not be forgotten. To Kathy, she left the photo albums and her mother's jewelry on the condition that she visit Margaret's sister in the nursing home twice a year for the next 5 years. To Andrew, she left a single item, an antique mirror from the guest room. It came with a handwritten note. "So you can finally take a long look at yourself." And to her grandchildren, well, that would come later. The biggest reveal was still to come. Margaret wasn't planning revenge in the traditional sense. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was simply done being invisible. Every family has its silent roles. Some are handed out early and worn like name tags. Others are assigned slowly, shaped over years of whispered comparisons and glances that say more than words ever could. In Margaret's family, the roles were painfully clear. Andrew, the golden child. Kathy, the scapegoat. Hadn't always been that way. When they were younger, Kathy was the one who helped Margaret with dinner, who made her mother laugh just by walking into a room. She was sensitive, creative, and always tried too hard to make everyone else feel okay, even when she wasn't. Andrew, on the other hand, was loud and charming. He broke the rules and smiled while doing it. He always knew how to say just enough to get out of trouble. And when Walter was alive, Andrew could do no wrong in his father's eyes. Margaret loved them both. But over time the balance tipped. Kathy grew into the role of caretaker, dutiful but overlooked. If she complained, she was emotional. If she asked for help, she was too needy. And Andrew, every misstep was forgiven. Late payments, bad investments, even a brief separation from his wife after an affair. Margaret bailed him out, gently but consistently. Each time she hoped it would be the last. But it never was. When Margaret first mentioned the will to Kathy, quietly, over a game of cards, Kathy flinched. "Mom," she said, "don't talk like that." "I'm not dying," Margaret replied, voice calm. "I'm just planning." Kathy hesitated, then gave a sad smile. "It's just, I know if Andrew finds out, he'll think I talked you into something." And that was the root of it. Kathy, always afraid of being blamed. Always afraid of being seen as the one who meddled. Margaret saw it now as clear as day. Her daughter wasn't weak. She was worn down, weathered by decades of being the one expected to carry the emotional weight while her brother floated free. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't her fault. So Margaret made a promise to herself. This would be the one time Kathy didn't have to ask for anything. She would just receive. No guilt. No scrutiny. Just recognition. As for Andrew, the man had no idea he was about to lose everything he thought was guaranteed. He still called once a month, mostly with updates about his business. He never asked about Margaret's health or her life. He didn't know that she'd started writing again. Short stories, mostly, based loosely on her own family. He didn't know that she had weekly tea with her neighbor across the street, or that she'd rejoined the local book club. He didn't know she was still a person, with dreams, opinions, boundaries. Because he didn't ask. He assumed. And that assumption was going to cost him more than he could imagine. Margaret didn't need to scream to reclaim her voice. She just needed to let the truth speak louder than the silence they'd left her in for years. It began with small things. Mild fatigue, dizzy spells in the morning, forgetting why she walked into a room. Margaret, ever the pragmatist, chalked it up to age. "This old engine just needs a little more oil," she joked to her neighbor. But deep down, she knew something was shifting. It wasn't until she collapsed in the garden one afternoon, the shears still in her hand, that reality forced its way in. She spent 3 nights in the hospital. Kathy came immediately. Bags under her eyes, cardigan buttoned wrong, worry in every gesture. She brought Margaret her favorite magazine and a puzzle book, just like she used to when Margaret had migraines during Kathy's childhood. Andrew didn't come until the 4th day. And when he did, he was all business. "Mom, you should have called me. You know I'm just a phone call away." Margaret smiled weakly. "I did call. You didn't answer. I left a message." "Oh," he said, shifting. "Well, I've been buried in quarterly stuff. I mean, you know how it is." She did. She knew exactly how it was. The diagnosis came a week later. Early-stage Parkinson's. Manageable, yes, but degenerative. It would steal small pieces of her over time, until it took much more. Strangely, she didn't feel fear. Not exactly. What she felt was urgency. Time, the thing she'd always thought she had plenty of, was now ticking a little louder in her ears. The plan she'd carefully constructed with Eleanor, the letters, the clauses, the conditions, they all needed to be perfect, final, undeniable. Her illness gave her clarity. It also revealed something unexpected. Strength. Margaret started doing something she hadn't done in decades. She said no. No to visitors who drained her. No to family dinners where she was ignored. No to pretending she was okay when she wasn't. Kathy was stunned at first. "You've changed," she said one afternoon after Margaret refused to let Andrew move her into an expensive retirement condo he happened to have a stake in. "No," Margaret replied. "I've just remembered who I was before I made everyone else comfortable." There was power in that. The illness, though unkind, had stripped away her last illusion, that if she stayed quiet and loving enough, they would see her. Instead, she realized they saw what they wanted to see. A frail old woman. Burden. An afterthought. So she gave them what they expected, until the very end. The final changes to the will were made 3 months later. Eleanor, ever the professional, raised a brow at one detail. "You're sure about the delivery method?" "Absolutely," Margaret said, eyes steady. "It has to be read out loud. All of it. At the house. Won't that be dramatic?" Margaret smirked. "They love drama. Let them have some." She wasn't aiming to cause pain, but she wasn't protecting egos anymore either. This wasn't about revenge. It was about release. Let the truth ring through the halls they'd once filled with laughter, then silence, then contempt. Let them finally hear what they'd been ignoring for years. The reading took place on a cold, bright Sunday, just after the funeral, just as Margaret had planned. Her instructions were meticulous. It had to happen in the living room of the old house, the one they'd all grown up in, surrounded by her books, her china, her memories. No sterile law office. No quiet conference call. She wanted them home. Kathy sat curled on the edge of the old green armchair, still wearing the pearl pin Margaret had left for her in a sealed envelope. Andrew stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, jaw tight. His wife, Lauren, sat next to him, flipping through her phone until Eleanor, Margaret's lawyer, entered with a sealed folder in hand. The room quieted like a stage waiting for curtains to rise. Per Margaret Eliza Thomason's final instructions, Eleanor began, "This will is to be read in full, in the presence of her immediate family." Andrew smirked. "Can we skip to the important parts? I'm assuming the house goes to me and Kathy splits the accounts." Eleanor didn't flinch. She opened the file and began to read. Margaret's voice, preserved in Eleanor's calm cadence, began like a letter. "To my children, if you're hearing this, then I've left this world on my terms. I've spent most of my life loving quietly, hoping that would be enough. But as I grew older, I realized silence only serves those who benefit from it. Today that silence ends. The air turned heavy. Kathy glanced down, her hands trembling. Andrew, you were always the boy with charm. You knew how to get what you wanted, and people gave it freely, your father included. I gave too because I believed love meant sacrifice. But love without respect is not love. It's fear. And I'm no longer afraid of losing you, because I already lost you the moment you began seeing me as leverage instead of a mother. Lauren looked up from her phone. Andrew turned pale. Kathy, my daughter, my mirror. You carried too much for too long. You were blamed, diminished, and still you loved. I see that now more than ever. I regret not defending you more when it mattered. But this is me finally doing right by you. Eleanor paused and turned the page. To Andrew I leave my forgiveness. That is all. Gasps echoed in the room. To Kathy, I leave the house, all remaining accounts, personal belongings, and the publishing rights to my short stories. I leave them not out of guilt or pity, but because I know you'll do something beautiful with them. You always have. Andrew stepped forward. Wait, what? That can't be right. She must have been confused, she was sick. She was of sound mind, Eleanor said flatly. I have her on record, video and notarized. She was clearer than most. Andrew's wife muttered. This is outrageous. But Kathy sat silently, tears slipping down her cheek. Not from greed, not from gloating, but from something that felt like justice. Finally, Margaret had spoken her truth. In life they hadn't heard her. But in death, she made sure her voice was the loudest in the room. In the weeks that followed the reading of the will, the Thomason family changed. Not overnight, not cleanly, but deeply. Kathy moved back into the old house, not because of the inheritance, but because it felt like a final act of reconciliation between her and the woman who raised her. Every room held echoes now. Her mother's soft humming in the kitchen, the scratch of her pen late at night, the quiet sighs she must have let out when no one was around to notice. She didn't touch Margaret's writing desk for 3 days. When she finally opened it, she found 2 things: a leather-bound journal and a photo of the 3 of them, Margaret, Kathy, and Andrew, taken at the lake house when Kathy was 12. The journal wasn't a diary. It was a roadmap. Margaret had titled it simply, How I Remember It. It was a recounting of her emotional truth, not facts and timelines, but the feelings behind every choice she'd made. The hopes she carried, the disappointments she swallowed, the love she never stopped offering, even when it was met with silence or strategy. Kathy read it slowly over the course of a month. Hurt. And it healed. Meanwhile, Andrew attempted to contest the will. His lawyer made noise, cited undue influence and mental decline. But Eleanor was prepared. Margaret had dotted every I, crossed every T. Every change to the will had been witnessed, recorded, and dated, long before her health had ever declined. Eventually, Andrew dropped the case. Quietly, wordlessly, he stopped calling. Kathy didn't chase him. For once, she wasn't cleaning up a mess she didn't make. Instead, she did something unexpected, something that would have made her mother proud. She published Margaret's stories. They weren't sweeping novels or commercial thrillers. They were quiet vignettes, each one about ordinary women doing extraordinary things when no one was watching. Women who endured. Women who woke up one day and said, "Enough." Women who remembered who they were, even when the world tried to forget them. The collection was called The Quiet Rebellion. It found its audience, not in bestseller lists or literary prizes, but in the hearts of those who saw themselves reflected in Margaret's words. Grandmothers, mothers, daughters. People who knew the weight of silence and the cost of speaking. Years later, a young woman knocked on Kathy's door holding a worn copy of the book. "My grandmother made me read this before she passed," she said. She said, "This is how you reclaim your story." Kathy invited her in. Because some legacies aren't about money or property or punishment. They're about truth. About finally being heard. Not for revenge but for release. Margaret's story wasn't loud, but it was powerful. And in telling it, she taught her daughter and countless others, that it's never too late to reclaim your voice, not even in your golden years. In families that ignore, dismiss, and belittle, revenge doesn't always come in anger. Sometimes it comes in paperwork, in dignity, in truth. Thank you for watching.